Job chapter 32. Job 32, page 349 in the Pew Bibles. Tonight's lesson is Elihu Speaks. Elihu Speaks. Chapters 32 through 37 are all spoken by Elihu. There is no response to Elihu given by anyone. We hear nothing. In the prior 31 chapters, Elihu is never mentioned. When we get to chapter 38, to the end of the book, Elihu is never mentioned. This is all we have of Elihu. And that has led a lot of people to the conclusion that these were added after the fact and are not really part of the actual events that took place during Job's timeline. Obviously, I disagree with that. Some commentators have arrived at that position, but I disagree with that. It seems pretty evident that it's, with the combination of everything, it seems pretty evident that this is easily something that could have happened, especially based on, if the person did add it after the fact, they did a very, very good job of hiding all these little details in the notes that point us to the fact that this actually happened. So, but it is a unique section, and it's a confusing section, let's put it that way, because he says so much that is very, very good and very valid, and he says a lot of true things about God, and he goes into a lot of great details. However, at the same time, he ends up with some conclusions that are not exactly accurate. And though he claims to be farther off or approaching Job's problem from a different direction, a lot of what he says is somewhat similar to things that they've already said and already agreed upon, and he's acting like, and it sounds like he's saying, this is brand new data that they hadn't considered before when they previously said, yeah, we already talked about that. So it's an interesting section, that's for sure. Elihu is a much younger man, as he denotes in chapter 32, as letting the old men speak first, and then he, as a younger man, did not speak until they were done speaking. The problem we will see is that his explanation eventually simply falls into the same category, basically, as ones that have already been given, although with a slightly different twist to it. A few of the themes that are predominant here in Elihu's speech are suffering as instruction. Suffering is instruction. In other words, suffering can be divine punishment. Suffering can be as a result of sin that you did, but also suffering could be simply to instruct you, to teach you. And so that is one of the things that he brings up, and that contrasts with the arguments of Job's friends who insisted Job had to have sinned to deserve this kind of suffering. Another theme is God's transcendence. He emphasizes the greatness and the transcendence of God above all humans, and in the difficulty of human beings being unable to fully understand why God does what God does. Another theme is that of God's justice. Throughout his speeches, he passionately defends the fact God is just. God is always just. Even when his actions appear mysterious, incomprehensible, and illogical in our minds, God is always just, always, always. The fourth theme that pops up here and there are human limitations, as I mentioned, and that is the limitation of human understanding. And Elihu criticizes Job for questioning God's justice and insisting that human beings have no right to have a demand as an explanation for their suffering. So,
is there something specific about Job's behavior that they can criticize him?
no. Well, I suppose so, actually. So, because of the suffering that he's faced, that's why they're criticizing him, but also the fact that he wouldn't stop defending himself, that he was confident and he was righteous. Well, verse 32, verse 1 that we'll read here in just a moment, they ceased to answer him because he was righteous in his own eyes. He wasn't going to stop in being adamant that he had done nothing wrong. So number one is chapter 32, Elihu and his explanation, and he explains himself. And so I'm going to quickly read through verses 1 through 10. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he. When Elihu saw there was no answer in their mouth of these three men, then his wrath was kindled. And Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. I said, days should speak, and multitudes of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in a man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Therefore I said, hearken to me, I also will show my opinion. So this is his explanation for why he's saying what he's about to say. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, they stop trying to convince Job. They stop attempting to convince Job that his suffering is the result of sin, because they see he's made up his mind. There's no chance we're going to be able to convince Job of this and how wrong Job is in their opinion. But then this man Elihu, who details and says, I've been present this whole time. I've heard the arguments that you guys have provided. I've heard Job respond, but to this point I've kept silent because you're older than me and I'm younger. And that's how it worked in those days. And so that's the matter of fact, he says. I don't know why, being a much younger man, why he would have been present with Job and these other three, if they're all much older than him. It does seem like a bit of an oddity, and that also has caused commentators to wrestle with it. Why is this man that is seemingly not, he seems to be a friend of these, but not within their age range. Generally, your closer friends are those within the same age range as you. And so this seems like an odd disparity. Let's put it that way. Now, his heritage, that he was the son of Barachel, the Buzite, kindred of Ram, many people have tried to connect the dots to that to other places. Really, it doesn't tell us anything. It gives us his heritage, but it doesn't help us connect dots to a time frame for the book of Job or anything else, really, at all. A key note, however, that you probably picked up on in the first 5 verses, verses 2 through 5 specifically, is that 4 times we're told his wrath was kindled, his wrath was kindled, his wrath was kindled, and his wrath was kindled. His anger is presented, I believe, for 2 reasons. The explanation is for 2 reasons. The first reason is that Job justified himself, he says in verse 2, rather than God. In other words, the basic thought is this: Job's continual confidence that he had not sinned to deserve this, in Elihu's eyes, was paramount to Job saying, I'm more righteous than God. I did nothing to deserve this, therefore he claimed to be more righteous than God, is what Elihu's seeing and thinking. Now, obviously, that was not at all what Job was doing. This was Elihu's perspective on it. And we do see that theme as you go through these chapters, is multiple times Elihu responds, or he quotes Job and says, you said this, and then he'll go into something, and many times he misunderstands or misrepresents what Job said to justify what he's about to say. Obviously, he does that in this instance. The second instance of his wrath and anger is toward the 3, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, because they were unable to present sufficient evidence to certainly answer Job's claim of innocence. Job said multiple times, show me if I've done anything wrong, and they were never able to show him. All they had was their words of being just dogmatic. You sinned. You're a cataclysmically bad sinner. You're a terrible person. You had to have done something. And Job's like, well, show me, and they never have any proof. No true answer.
Maybe somebody else is bad.
Correct.
I mean, really.
Yeah, yeah. Now, the theme, a theme, I should say, in verses 6 down through verse 22, the conclusion of chapter 32, would be righteous anger over theological misunderstandings. In other words, Elihu believes that both Job and his friends have fundamentally misunderstood God's justice. And so therefore he feels compelled, I must now speak and defend God's honor. In verses 6 through 10, he addresses the fact, I'm younger, you're older, I've been reluctant to speak. What was continually taught during those days was, the older you are, the wiser you are. The longer you live, obviously, the older or the wiser you are. And surely, the older would have a much better understanding of things in life. And while not being inaccurate, that is generally true. Age should bring wisdom, age should bring understanding, but it doesn't necessarily mean someone younger can't have wisdom or understanding. That's more than someone of a certain age. That's not how it has to be. That's not a hard and fast rule. Now, Elihu sees that, clearly these older men have failed. So now I am compelled to speak. I must now say something. And in verses 8 and 9, he introduces his thesis, the theological idea that is going to guide his thoughts all the way through. And he says in verse 8, but there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Elihu's assertion is age does not bring true wisdom. Experience does not always bring an understanding of judgment. Rather, his claim is this: God's Spirit brings wisdom and brings judgment, which would be accurate to a degree. I wouldn't say it's inaccurate, but obviously, as we looked at with Job's statement, is this: what? Where does wisdom come from? Well, wisdom comes from the fear of God. Fearing God brings wisdom. And we could say, yes, the Spirit is the one who gives that wisdom. So it's not inaccurate. It might just be a little bit extra technical, if you will. And so he says it's the inspiration of the Almighty that helps men, regardless of their age, regardless of their status, regardless of their life experience, that helps them understand the events that occur in life. And apparently, clearly, Elihu believes that the Spirit has given him said understanding into this situation. Barry Webb, long quote here, probably should have split it into 2 slides, but Barry Webb stated, Elihu has also shown considerable patience, carefully waiting and listening and paying close attention to the arguments of the older men, but found them inadequate. Therefore, he has also found inadequate their reason for giving up. They salved their wounded pride with the conceit that they themselves have all the wisdom possible for human beings to have, and that only God can deal with Job. Elihu thinks otherwise. Whether he is right or not, again, remains to be seen, but at least he has made a good case for his right to make a further attempt, especially as he intends to proceed differently. He will not try to shore up the arguments of the 3 friends because they were not ones that he himself would have used. He will make a fresh start using different arguments. Or that's what it seems as though he's going to do. What he says he's going to do. Is that what's going to happen? Not really. He goes on, and I like his illustration that he uses in verse 19. Basically, I tried to hold my tongue. I've sat here through all this back and forth between you 3 and Job, and I've tried to hold my tongue, but behold, my belly is as wine which has no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. A very picturesque language, that's for sure. I got to tell you what it is. And of course, he concludes the chapter saying, let me not, I pray you. Please, let me tell you this. I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to respect you as to what your title is. Basically, he's saying, I am going to tell you the truth 100%. I'm not going to beat around the bush in any doing so. So his actual argument comes starting in chapter 33, Elihu and the purpose of suffering. He begins and he implores Job, hear me. Hear what I have to say to you. Listen to the words that I am about to say. He says, I'm not going to tell you the same things that everybody else has told you. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear, Job. Instead, I am going to limit myself to speaking only that which I clearly know. He states in verse 6, Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I also am formed out of the clay. In other words, Job, you asked for an audience with God. Well, you don't have God here, but in God's stead, I am the fulfillment of that wish. Now, I don't know if that's a bit of arrogance, maybe a little bit. He seems arrogant in many other places as well, but that just could have been how he spoke. And so it's a really tough thing to decipher. He does, however, say at the end there, I also am formed out of the clay. In other words, I realize I'm no more special than you are. Like, I was created out of the exact same dirt that you were created out of. So, again, a tough pickle to decide. Is he being ridiculously arrogant here in what he's saying? Or does he have some insight? Elihu goes on and he summarizes what Job has said, or claimed, or what he believes Job has claimed. Job, you've declared your innocence. You stated that it appears as though God is treating you as an enemy. Job, you said that it seems as though God has bound you in chains and is watching your every step, even though you are innocent of wrongdoing. And so that's what he says, and then he begins to challenge Job's understanding in verse 12, or the understanding that he set up. And Elihu argues this: God is greater than any human being. God is not accountable to human beings for his actions. He says God often communicates with human beings in indirect ways through dreams or visions. And he even goes into examples on that. And he states that the reason for doing so, the reason God speaks in different indirect ways, is to turn men from their wrongdoings and to protect them from destruction. He states in verses 19 through 22 that suffering is not always punitive. Sometimes it serves as a form of divine communication or divine discipline. Elihu believes Job's suffering, his suffering is actually an opportunity for instruction or correction rather than simply punishment for sin. He goes on and seems to claim that he is an inspired messenger of God. He states that sometimes God uses physical suffering to turn people back from the brink of the grave. According to Elihu, suffering may serve a redemptive purpose by bringing a person into deeper understanding of God's will. And he concludes chapter 33 by urging Job to listen to his words. And he promises that he will defend God's justice. Now, something to remember is this. Elihu, like the others in this drama, are completely unaware of chapters 1 and 2. They have no idea what actually happened behind the scenes and why this is all happening. Elihu has no more insight into this than Job did, than anybody else did. At least none that we can clearly see or is evidenced. Elihu was right in calling out the others for being so dogmatic that, Job, you're suffering because of your sin. He was right to call that out because that wasn't true. He was right in realizing, hey, God often has many reasons to allow suffering. And God can use various means through suffering to instruct and to bring discipline and to correct and to grow. And God can use multiple means to do this. Unfortunately, I don't believe Elihu was wise as to speculating on why Job was suffering. Let me reword that. Let me see if I find the verse here that I marked. I don't know that I did. Now, I'm not sure which verse I was referencing, but basically, Elihu was not intending to speculate on why you're suffering. Rather, he was going to consider how Job should respond to his suffering. Instead of worrying about why this happened, instead we should worry about what we're doing in response to what happened. And I think that is often the problem with us, as all human beings. We worry about, why is this happening? Why did this happen? Why did I get cancer? Why did I break my leg? Why did all this happen? Why is this suffering happen? Why did that person have to die? Why did all these things happen? And we worry so much about why, when in reality, the why, we may never know. We might not know for years. We may never, ever, ever know why. God doesn't say He's going to tell us why. But in reality, I believe the fact is that we should be considering how we respond. It's a lot less about why this thing happened. It's a lot more about how do we respond when that thing happens. And so I believe Elihu was wise to at least bring that to the forefront. He continues in chapter 34 and discusses Elihu and God's justice. He turns his attention to what he believed was Job's challenge to God's justice. And he accuses Job of claiming that, it's pointless to try and please God because God treats the righteous and the wicked in the same ways. Again, he kind of misrepresents what Job has previously said to bring about his argument. It's really difficult to nail Elihu down one way or the other, because he says things that are very, 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 very true, and at the same time misrepresents someone. You're like, it's real tough to go one way or the other with this guy. Basically, Elihu's interpretation of Job's argument is that Job has essentially given up on the possibility that God acts justly. Elmer Schmick explains the problem with this. As we examine this chapter, we should keep in mind that Elihu had picked out of Job's speeches those words and ideas that sounded particularly damaging. Job had had questions about the justice of God, and he had emphatically inserted his innocence. But none of this should be viewed independently of Job's total statement. In other words, he was just clipping bits and pieces of what Job said and responding to those instead of responding to the whole argument of what Job was saying. Job's claim to innocence was always given in the context of his reason for suffering. And while he had questioned the mystery of theodicy, he had also made clear he believed in God's justice. So much that he was willing to rest his entire case, all his hope, on that one issue. Like the counselors, Elihu picked out only those words of Job that he needed in order to prove his point. In other words, Elihu claims, Job, you're saying that God's justice isn't correct, which is not what Job was saying. Job was saying, God's justice is perfect. I will be vindicated. That's how he could rest his case, as we looked at last week. That's how he could end his words and say, I've not done anything wrong. I'm resting my case. God is just. God will right it all in the end. That's how he could say that, because he knew God was just. But along the way, some of the wording that Job used is misrepresented by Elihu. And basically, this misunderstanding causes Elihu to, again, say a lot of right things, but draw a lot of wrong conclusions because he wasn't listening properly. In verse 10 of chapter 34, he passionately defends the idea that God is always just. He says, "Therefore hearken unto me, ye men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should commit iniquity." And that is true. God does not do any wickedness. God does no wickedness at all, ever. He goes on, "For the work of a man shall he render unto him, and cause every man to find according to his ways." In other words, God, you reap what you sow. The work of men, God will give you what you worked for. "Yea," verse 12, "surely God will not do wickedly, neither will the Almighty pervert judgment." So he defends God's justice in verses 13 through 15. Elihu highlights God's sovereignty, stating that if God were to withdraw his spirit from the earth, all life would perish. And the implication is this: humans have no standing to question God's justice because their very existence depends on him. That's his thought anyway. He continues and emphasizes, God sees everything that happens on earth. Nothing escapes God's notice. God judges the high, God judges the low. Nobody's going to hide from God's justice. Nobody's going to escape God's justice. Elihu's point is that Job's complaints about God's injustice are unfounded because God sees the hearts of all people and judges them accordingly. And therefore, Job's suffering cannot be the result of a divine injustice, which, again, is all true, but not really in reference to Job's situation. Now, in the closing section of chapter 34, Elihu urges Job to repent of his rebellious attitude. He says in verse 37, "For he," that is Job, "addeth rebellion unto his sin. He clappeth his hands among us, and multiplieth his words against God." Basically, he believes that Job's protesting and his confidence in innocence are misguided. And instead, Job should simply acknowledge this is God's justice, and he should submit to whatever discipline that God is bringing in his life. He portrays Job as stubbornly refusing to admit any kind of wrongdoing. He continues into chapters 35, 36, and 37, which I've entitled Elihu and God's Righteousness. And again, Elihu prided himself in presenting different arguments when in reality the substance of his arguments was basically the same as everybody else's. Look at verse 5, for example. He says, "Look unto the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than thou. If thou sinnest, what doest thou against him? Or if thy transgressions be multiplied, what doest thou unto him? If thou be righteous, what givest thou him, or what receiveth he of thine hand?" Basically the same thing that they already agreed upon. Or not necessarily agreed upon, but basically the same thing that they previously said. God's holy. God is great. God is so far above everyone else. What man does on earth, God doesn't really care about that. You'd have to be a tremendously bad sinner in order for God to stop doing what he's doing, to stoop down to earth to have to deal with you, is basically what he said previously. G. Campbell Morgan said it this way: "God is indeed God, but Elihu missed how close God comes to man." Truth is, God does listen to the cry of the oppressed. God doesn't only stoop down of heaven to deal with tremendous sinners. No, God is among sinners. God is very God, but he stoops down to man and deals with man individually, personally, with ease. Chapter 36, Elihu defends God's justice and his majesty, and he claims that God exalts the righteous and he brings the wicked low. Again, true things. He reiterates, suffering can serve as a form of discipline. Suffering can help people to turn from sin, to grow in righteousness. Again, true things. He warns Job, don't turn to sin and rebellion in response to the suffering. Instead, he says, trust in God's wisdom, trust in God's justice. Again, a good admonition, albeit misguided. His argument here is that Job's suffering is not necessarily punitive, but could be a form of divine instruction. And he encourages Job, just embrace this suffering as an opportunity to grow rather than viewing it as evidence of God's injustice. The final section of verse 36, he shifts from a direct critique of Job to really meditating, if you will, giving us truths about God's majesty and the magnificence of his work. He describes how God is more powerful than all nature. He controls the weather. He sends the rain and lightning according to his will. He points to the storm as a symbol of God's power and transcendence, suggesting humans cannot fully comprehend God's ways. Chapter 37, he continues that and talks of how God is to be feared. He marvels at his control over the forces of nature. He describes the thunder, the snow, the whirlwind. Those are all expressions of God's majesty when we see those things. His point is this: God's power is so vast and incomprehensible, it is futile for human beings to question God's justice. And in the closing verses of chapter 37, Elihu calls on Job to consider the greatness of God and humble himself before God's inscrutable wisdom. He says this: touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment, and in plenty of justice he will not afflict. Men do therefore fear him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart. Again, a lot of good truth, albeit somewhat misguided toward Job. In conclusion, overall, if you read these chapters, I don't have time to read them directly, but Elihu provides, again, a lot of truth, a lot of beauty, a lot of glory about God, that if we were to go through them, we could say these are true and right statements. But within the context of Job, within what Elihu is trying to do, he just missed the mark by that much, if you will. Carl Henry stated this way: although Elihu came close to the truth that men must always trust God, even when life seems to go wrong, still he missed the full meaning of faith. It is not wrong to inquire of God with honest doubt. It is only wrong to let doubt cause faith to grow cold. It's okay to ask why. It's wrong, however, when you don't receive an answer right away, to allow that non-answer or that non-response so far to allow you to have less faith in God, less belief in God. And so, as I said before, everybody has a bit different view on Elihu and all he says and how it really fits in the grand narrative of Job. And I think part of that is the fact that there's no direct response. When we get to chapter 8, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Completely ignores Elihu, never mentioned again. Well, what is this guy supposed to be doing here then? We get to the chapter 42. And in the conclusion there, in chapter 42, after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends. Against the three of them. But what about Elihu? Nothing. So why is this here? I think the days are likely that it'll come that we are faced with two situations. One is that we could be in Job's situation. People are going to come out of the woodwork, and they're going to try to tell you, this is why this is happening. This is why this is happening. And they may say a lot of right things combined with a lot of wrong things. And we might have to remember in this position, we don't have to respond to each of them. Job doesn't respond to Elihu. He made his case. He knew the truth. He rested. Again, as we looked at on Sunday, God knows his heart. God knows the truth. God will be vindicated. God will let it all be known someday. And so if we end up in Job's circumstances and people like Elihu come along, we should allow our confidence in God, allow our knowledge that God knows our heart to be rested in, as opposed to trying to respond to every single claim of all these people. You don't have to respond. A second situation is possible to come, and that is this. We're put in the position of Elihu. We hear a lot of people saying a lot of things. All the problems of the world, all the problems of everyone's individual situation, and we can be standing on the outside looking into someone's suffering, looking into the problems in someone's life, and we may feel compelled to speak into their situation. I think in that situation we have to make sure that we stop and consider what we're about to say, and that we don't straw man them, if you will, and straw man their position, which is, so a straw man is, do any of you not know what a straw man is? Let me put it that way. So in argument, if you set up a straw man, that is to represent someone's position. So if you're arguing that this flower is red, a straw man would be to go around and not really present the truest arguments about your case that this flower is red, but rather to present close to it, but not really close to it. That way I can come along with my argument that that flower is yellow and knock down your argument very easily. Whereas to steel man an argument is to use that position's hardest and most valid arguments, and then you come against their best arguments to destroy them. So Elihu essentially strawmanned Job. He picked little bits and pieces of Job, not the whole thing. So he could have had steel, instead he chose straw, basically, to make it easier to knock down Job's argument and show how foolish Job was and how ridiculous Job was, when in reality that's not at all true as to what was going on. So my thought in this is, when we're put in Elihu's position and we feel the urge that we are compelled to speak into someone's situation, we must be very, 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 very sure that we are not choosing bits and pieces of people's circumstances to say things about people and to blast people like Elihu did that aren't entirely true, but they make us look really smart. They make us look like we really know how to argue it. We really know how to show how majestic God is, when in reality, behind the scenes, he was twisting things a little bit here and there. Hence why when we read of Elihu's stuff in here, there's a little bit of arrogance in there, that it almost seems like there's some arrogance about, I know all this and you're completely wrong. I think the encouragement also in that position is to know God's word, not our own platitudes. When we're put in a position where we can speak into someone's life like Elihu into Job, we don't need to offer our thoughts. We need to offer God's truth, His wisdom into their life, not ours. And those are the things. The truth of God's word are the things that will help people in those situations. So that's Elihu Speaks. It's an interesting section, that's for sure. Next week we will cover The Lord Speaks.